Well, thank you everyone for coming. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. And as some more people come in, they'll pick up wherever we are. We're also, as a practice for our upcoming forums, live streaming to Facebook tonight. So our audience is even a little bigger than what's here. We're so glad that Ian's here, and he has just a few things he wants us to keep in mind, which Susie's going to talk about.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So my job tonight is the official muter of folks. So if you have troubles muting yourself, I get to do that for you. Ion's going to talk, and when he's ready for questions, he's going to let us know. And then you can post your question in the chat if you'd like, or raise your hand. And we'll do our best to call you as we can, okay? So that's pretty much what I had. Did I miss something, Kathy? I don't know.
I think we're good to turn it over to the master.
And I think there's a few more people that need muting.
Well, as it's 7:02, I'm going to begin. And I'm going to begin by introducing myself, because a lot of people probably don't know my background since I've turned into history. My name's Ion Sancho, and I was the Leon County Supervisor of Elections from 1988 through 2016. And that was 28 years of labor of love. And I will tell you that I told people that I was a blessed individual because I would have done the job for free and they paid me to do it. But let me tell you how I got into that job. I got into that job because I was a third-year law student in 1986, and I just finished taking environmental law with Wade Hopping, former Supreme Court Justice, conservative, who infuriated me and made me pretty sure I wanted to be an environmental lawyer, particularly because of Wade Hopping. And what I ended up doing was, in 1986, the Florida legislature passed landmark legislation creating the first land use management plan in the history of the state of Florida. By the way, it has since been rescinded by Republican governors and Republican legislators. And let me just throw out this little factoid here. The Florida legislature has been completely controlled by the Republicans, as the governor's office has since 1998. Many people don't realize that we've basically had over 2 decades of solid Republican control. And that is what has kind of brought us to this moment in history, unfortunately. But in 1986, I decided to take off my last semester at FSU Law School and run for a newly created single-member districts. The NAACP had successfully sued Leon County to create single-member districts because of the large African-American population, which had never successfully elected anyone to the county commission. So the courts discerned that there was racially polarized voting in Leon County, and they required that single-member districts be implemented. The Leon County Commission, under the Supreme Court rules, got the first crack at how to create single-member districts. And in the March primary in 1986, they attempted to craft a plan of 4 single-member districts and 3 at-large districts. That was put before the citizens in the March presidential primary in 1986 and was soundly defeated, forcing the Leon County Commission to go back to the drawing board, and they devised the plan that we currently have now, with 5 single-member districts and 2 at-large individuals. I ran for single-member District 5 in a crowded field that had myself, a former county commissioner, a lobbyist from FAMU, and Gary Jordan, a talk show host. And what happened was the election melted down in the August primary of 1986. Then Supervisor of Elections, Jan Petrick, a Republican who had been elected in the controversy over Wilma Sullivan attempting to pass the position over to her son, Johnny Sullivan, that left a bad stink in the community's mouth. And what happened was that the citizens repudiated Johnny Sullivan. Even though he won, he had 8 write-in candidates that ran against him, as he was the only candidate who qualified before the noon deadline, because he was the only person that knew that his mother wasn't running for re-election. And actually, a majority of the community voted for one of the write-in candidates. There were over 50% of all the votes cast in that Supervisor of Elections race was in fact cast for the write-ins. But the plurality winner was Johnny Sullivan. Johnny Sullivan then was defeated when he came up for re-election in 1984. He was replaced by the first Republican countywide official that we had ever elected. And in the first general election that the supervisor administered, over 5,000 people were turned away from the polls in the largest electoral meltdown in the history of Florida in the August primary of 1986. And I can remember my wife coming home after trying to vote right after the polls opened. And basically she was in tears because she didn't know if her vote for me was even counted. Because the Supervisor of Elections office, facing the pressure of creating these single member districts, had really poorly designed the ballot on a lever voting machine. For most people who were not experienced with that, the lever voting machine was invented by Thomas Alva Edison in the 1880s. We were using a variant of that lever mechanical voting machine in 1986. And problems occurred, machines weren't properly programmed, and individuals that tried to vote could not pull down the mechanical levers. And that just completely destroyed the validity of the election. I sued as a candidate for the election to have the election set aside until an actual valid election could be conducted for the citizens. But as Judge Hall, after a multi-day trial, told me, Mr. Sancho, there's no precedent in the history of the state of Florida for setting aside an election and redoing it. And so he looked at me and told me, you don't have a legal remedy, Mr. Sancho. Your remedy is political. I knew exactly what Judge Hall said, and I left that courtroom knowing I was going to run for the Supervisor of Elections office and straighten out this mess. And I did that, and I became the first non-election official ever to be certified as a voting machine programmer on lever voting machines. At my own cost, I flew to Jamestown, New York, which is where the factory still was in existence for lever voting machines, got certified in how to properly operate them. And that was the basis of my campaign. I can operate these machines and make them count your votes properly. And that really brought me the victory. And I will tell you that when I jumped into the Supervisor of Elections race, the very first thing I recognized was the technology that we were using was in fact no good. Lever voting machines share a technique or share something with a much later type of technology that I didn't want either, and that was touchscreen voting machines. Lever machines and touchscreen voting machines cannot do recounts. A recount is adding up all the individual votes again to get the correct total. Lever machines and touchscreen voting machines are aggregators. Once the individual has cast their ballot, it goes to one single number. it is impossible to do a recount by looking at the individual voters' intents and add them up again. You can't see them either on a lever voting machine or the touchscreen voting machine, which led me to go into an optical scan paper ballot mode, because my own experience in 1986 taught me that I wanted to make sure that I could stand behind every voter's vote and tell them your vote counted as you intended. That made me an outlier also with my Association of Supervisor of Elections. A majority of the Supervisor of Elections use mechanical scanning machines that would not give individuals a chance to correct mistakes. These systems were manufactured by a company called the AIS. And AIS voting machines were scanners tabulated at the courthouse at a central facility. So a voter who has made a simple voting error would not have the ballot in front of them to correct it. And when I went visiting different counties around the state and looking at how they conducted elections, I was shocked that most supervisor of elections didn't really care about what all the voters' intents were. They were not sensitized, as I was, to the fact that citizens ought to have their votes counted as they intended. So I purchased an optical scan voting system. I was the second jurisdiction in the United States of America to go to an optical scan system that was marketed actually by a Canadian developer. We instituted those devices in the state of Leon County in 1992, the first presidential election that I administered, an election in which had an 82% turnout of registered voters, breaking every modern day voting record that Leon County had, and also generating long lines at the polls. The largest precincts that we had in the Northeast had lines of voters upwards of 2 hours, which actually led me to my next invention, which was early voting. In 1992, I went to a conference in Texas and listened to a presentation by the Republican Secretary of State, who talked about a wonderful practice they had in their state called early voting, in which citizens could vote at strip malls, at different private facilities and libraries, and get their vote in. And Texas shared something that Florida had, huge populations. And it was almost impossible, if you had a large turnout, to get all the citizens to cast that vote on one day. I'd like to remind the citizens that vote by mail was really a very minor part of voting in the state of Florida. You had to have an excuse to not vote at the polls on election day in 1992. You had to be not in the county. But what I found was that there was a very, very undefined statute in the Florida election law called in-office voting. And having a law degree now, since I did go back to FSU and graduate in December before I ran for the position, I knew full well that the authority of a constitutional officer was that unless the legislature barred me from doing something, if I had a rational basis for my action, I could do it. And so I implemented the in-office voting mechanism into early voting. People could come into my office and cast an in-office vote by mail ballot before the election, so we could actually start reducing the numbers of people that were still outstanding by election day. And early voting became one of the most popular ways to vote in Leon County. And in 1998, the Florida legislature adopted the procedures that we had written in Leon County for early voting and made it permissive so that any county in the state could do what we were doing. And I will tell you, the supervisors around the state were not happy. They did not like early voting. They didn't even like the name. They refused to call it early voting. They said in-office voting. But we called it early voting because that's what you were able to do. We expanded it out after 1994 and started using government facilities. And what happened was in 2000, we had the terrible, terrible infamous election that really brought everything to a halt in the United States of America. The technology that we were using was simply not able to accurately record citizens' votes. And we had not really instituted any kind of training for election officials. Basically, you were self-trained as an election official, something that I took full advantage of and started going to training sessions out of the state, since Florida didn't have training sessions. And actually, what I ended up doing was going to North Carolina. The state of North Carolina had a law that said that all election officials had to be certified and trained in their positions. So they brought in a group out of Houston, Texas called the Election Center. And I ended up going to Chapel Hill for 2 years and getting enough credits so I could become the first nationally certified election official in the state of Florida. Because again, I believe that you need information, you need data, you need training if you're going to excel. And so using my knowledge of voting, I kept changing the procedures. And when we had the election meltdown in 2000, that led to a major national election piece of legislation called the Help America Vote Act, which passed in 2002, which basically banned the lever voting machine. Any system that would not allow a voter at the precinct to correct a common error could not be used anymore. And that banned all the lever voting machines that were used in the United States of America. And what we had when we looked at our system in the 2000 election was we were the most accurate system in the state by far. We had an error rate, and that's a pejorative term which journalists use, but we don't use it. We call it the residual vote rate. We had a residual vote rate of less than 1/5 of 1%. That means we had almost every citizen in Leon County we could prove voted in the presidential race, and we actually put them on the internet. We put all 140 some thousand ballots that had votes in the presidential race on the internet so people could see all the properly marked ballots. There was really only double digits of individuals in this county that didn't even vote in that race. So it was minuscule. But what happened across the rest of the state in 2000 were error rates that boggled the mind, caused by mistakes by Supervisor of Elections. And I will tell you that two things roiled the 2000 election. The Secretaries of State office under Katherine Harris, under the General Counsel, issued a false felons list, which later on, the Secretary of State admitted disenfranchised over 18,000 legal African-American voters. This was in a race that was decided by 537 votes. Supervisor of Elections, not understanding the law, disqualified over 18,000 valid votes. And even with the fraudulent list that the Secretaries of State in Florida issued, Gore would have won the election, but for the improper counting of the votes by a Supervisor of Elections in 36 counties in the state of Florida. Let me tell you what happened. Not being trained meant that Supervisor of Elections didn't have a clue what the statute meant by saying an overvote was banned. An overvote is when an individual casts more legal votes than the candidates that they're allowed to vote for. So if you have a vote for one, but you select two different candidates in that race, that's an overvote. And 31 counties did this properly, including Leon County. 36 counties misdefined an overvote as a race that had more than one vote in it. And let me tell you how that destroyed the race. We had 10 presidential candidates on the 2000 ballot in the state of Florida, more than we've ever had before. Many individuals voted for their candidate, whether it was Bush or Gore. And then at the bottom of these 10 candidates, there was a slot that said, write in candidate. Well, since we don't train citizens in elections in the schools, many voters thought you write in the same name of the candidate that you voted for. So they would vote for Bush and write in Bush, or vote for Gore and then write Gore, as if they just wanted to prove the elections, want to conclusively prove who you're picking. Well, that's not an overvote, but it is a ballot that a machine can't read. And that meant that we had to, whenever someone voted for Gore, filled in the oval, and then wrote in Gore on the bottom, we had to take that ballot and duplicate it on an empty ballot and put one vote for the one candidate the individual was voting for. 36 counties threw out all of those voter choices incorrectly, in violation of the law. And if they had not done that, Gore would have won the election by 171 votes, as determined by the media consortium that took a year to tabulate all the ballots independently after the election. A tragedy. I call it an American tragedy. I thought it was the worst American tragedy in elections until I got to 2020. The election that keeps on giving, or grifting. But be that as it may, we did not discover this error by Supervisor of Elections until well past the certification deadline. But I will tell you that history is something that people should pay attention to, because most of you are aware of the efforts of a lawyer at the Claremont Institute, John Eastman, to have the 2020 election tossed out based upon the a principle called the sole legislative authority principle, that only the legislature can make a determination on who gets the electoral votes in a state. And that is being investigated now by the January 6th committee. It's being investigated by the Justice Department. But 2020 was not the first time that this happened. In the 2000 election, a young lawyer by the name of John Eastman came before the Florida legislature, and then House Speaker had a special hearing in late November of 2000, in which John Eastman presented this theory to the Florida legislature. And they were in the process of selecting a Bush slate, irrespective of what the Supreme Court of Florida and the voters had stated. They were full on going to do that in 2000, except that the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore rendered its horrible, illegal decision, a betrayal of democracy, to declare the elections Bush without allowing Florida to actually look at all of the ballots. A normal election in every state consists of a full recount, looking at what are called undervotes, all the ballots which have no votes recorded for a candidate, and all the overvotes, those ballots which had more than one legal candidate recorded. Florida never did that. There was never any examination of the overvotes, which is why the mistake of the Supervisor of Elections and their canvassing boards in 36 counties was tragic. We were never allowed by the Supreme Court to look at all the ballots, and thus the United States of America's history was inexorably altered, changed for all time. Something that really shocked me and changed this individual, who is simply an election nerd, into a much more activist individual, because all of a sudden I became aware that the Republican Party was attempting to manipulate the process, game the system. And as they were completely in control of the system, there was nothing that can be done. Bush won the election, making him in charge of the Justice Department. The Justice Department never investigated the improprieties of the 2000 election. There never was a federal government investigation. And as a result, most of the people never found out about the felons list, which was fraudulently imposed upon the Supervisor of Elections, a list which was enormously in error. Leon County received a voters list, this so-called felons list, from the AG of Catherine Harris, whose name was Bucky Mitchell, by the way. Bucky later on becomes, after he leaves the Secretary of State's office, he becomes the general counsel of the Republican Party, and later on bedevils African-American voters down the road in another capacity, which I'll get to. So, but what happened was the election now is settled. We are electing an individual who did not receive the number of votes, making him the #1 vote getter in the state of Florida. And I felt betrayed. I felt that democracy had been betrayed by the legal system, by the politicians, because quite frankly, election officials are trained to be nonpartisan. We want everyone to vote. We want all legal citizens to cast a vote and have that vote counted. And that is still the case today, which is why in the latest iteration of legislation coming down, Senate Bill 90 2 years ago and SB 524, which just passed, continual attacks on voters are being waged by the Republicans in the Florida legislature completely unnecessarily. But again, this goes all the way back to 2000. In 2000, I watched this happen, and because more Republicans were voting by mail, the very first major reform that the legislature did in 2002 was to make no excuse vote by mail voting. You can vote by mail without having to have an excuse for why you didn't vote in the polls. And so what you see from 2002 until today are Republicans using their absolute control in the legislature and in the governor's office to target Democratic voters, more particularly African-American voters, in every cycle. And when the cycle changed in 2018, we saw for the very first time a larger number of Democrats voting by mail. That changed the dynamics. And all of a sudden, vote by mail became the new target and is now the new target by the Republican Party. Because in 2020, 1.5 million more Democrats voted by mail than Republicans. So the Republican policy of attacking early voting, which they did in 2010, after Obama won the election in 2008, and the data showed that 54% of all of the African American voters that were cast for candidate Obama were cast in in-person early voting. What did the legislature do? Led completely under the control of the Republicans. They got rid of Sunday voting. What's the so-called souls to the polls? That became illegal in 2010 and was not available in 2012 when Obama ran for re-election. And the Republicans said, aha, we're going to get him now. Well, the law of unintended consequences popped up here because there was a large Republican group of voters who loved early voting, and they lived in Miami-Dade County. And Ann Navarro, who was a Republican Party state committeeman, objected and called out the Republicans and said, hey, my elderly Hispanic Cubans here, we like early voting. Why are you doing this? Well, they were doing this because so many African Americans preferred to vote in-person early voting. That's why they were doing that. But what happened was in 2012, these angered Hispanic Republicans turned out in droves and voted against McCain and against the Republicans. Obama in 2012 picked up over 100,000 additional votes in Miami-Dade over his 2008 total, and that swung the total to Obama, who only won the state by 79,000 votes. So I raised this issue because the attacks that we see now in 2020 and 2018 that have made it more difficult to vote by mail, basically, as of today, you have, if you don't have your driver's license on record, you're probably not going to be able to request a vote by mail ballot. And many of the older individuals didn't have to use a driver's license back in the 60s and 70s. They're still alive. They're still voting. But they don't have this bit of information. So I talked to Mark, and Mark has told me that probably over 1,000 voters need to redo their voter registration, which fortunately in Florida, you can update your voter registration online. You can go in and hit an update and add the missing criteria and now vote by mail. But let me point out that there were no changes at all in 2018 and 2020 to voting in person. The Republicans targeted voting by mail because that's what the Democrats in Florida did because of COVID. Because of COVID, the Democratic Party on a national level and on a state level decided we're going to push vote by mail. We're going to push it like we've never pushed it before. And they were successful. So the imposition of the new restrictions are only on vote by mail. There are no new identification requirements to vote in person, either in early voting or at the precinct. And the Republicans left all of it alone. There have been no changes and no additional restrictions. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not citizens go back to their prior practice of voting in person, or whether or not they're going to continue to vote by mail. I don't really have a preference, except that I did vote by mail because in June of 2020, I caught, unfortunately, an autoimmune disease, which renders my immune system gone. I don't have an immune system. So I voted by mail in the 2020 election cycle completely. And that's why I'm addressing you today, as opposed to actually being at the library or another facility where we could talk in this one-to-one. I simply can't be exposed to any kind of disease at this point in time. It's not fatal. And I think maybe within the year I can put this into remission, and then I'd like to start doing some speeches around the country. But until that time, I'm limited to Zoom. But again, the changes that we're talking about, and unfortunately, I have some bad news for individuals relative to the redistricting plan. The First District Court of Appeal, led by Judge Tannenbaum, has struck down the district court opinion that was rendered that said that the DeSantis plan was illegal and violated the Florida Constitution, which it does. The DeSantis plan renders the Fair Districts Amendment to the Florida Constitution. It renders it void. And so what DeSantis has done is essentially circumscribed the Florida Constitution. And the individual that I mentioned, Judge Tannenbaum, was in fact the lead attorney for the Secretary of State's office, defending the Secretary of State's office against the suits against this. Governor DeSantis selected him and put him in the First District Court of Appeal. The plaintiffs tried to have him stricken as being prejudiced since he had litigated this issue for DeSantis. The courts refused to remove him, and now we have the DeSantis plan, in all likelihood, will destroy the district that we have for Representative Al Lawson that was created by the Florida Supreme Court because of the Fair Districts Amendment. And quite frankly, I think it spells the end of the Voting Rights Act in a complete manner. There was a case called the RUCO case, RUCHO, that was a couple of years ago, and that's said that in federal redistricting cases or reapportionment cases, you cannot use racial criteria. And what DeSantis is doing an end run around Florida's Constitution. And eventually, when this goes to the United States Supreme Court, they're going to apply the RUCO decision to state constitutions and render state constitutions void that try to protect minorities. This is where we're going. It spells the end, the complete end of the Voting Rights Act, which quite frankly was the only thing that ended 100 years of American apartheid in the South. It was the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is what is responsible for allowing African Americans to vote for candidates such as Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and President Obama. Without the Voting Rights Act in force, those three Democratic candidates would not have been elected. And that's why the Republicans have waged a 3-decade war to destroy the Voting Rights Act. And unfortunately, we're on the verge of seeing success there, as they've captured the Supreme Court and placed on it ideologues versed in the philosophy of the Federalist Society, which really is not in the mainstream of legal thinking by any stretch of the imagination. And it's a sad day in America that our legal system has become biased and now will not protect and defend the right to vote, because most Americans do not recognize you have no federal constitutional right to vote in America. You do not have such a right. That is why the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore could terminate the counting procedures in the state of Florida in 2000. There is no federal amendment that guarantees all Americans the right to vote in federal offices. Your right to vote solely depends today on whether or not the legislature of the state that you reside in is going to respect it or not. And in Florida, they don't respect it. Now, let me fast forward to 2000, because what happened in 2000 was a grievous injury to the American body politic. I started writing in April of 2020 how Trump was going to declare that the election was fraudulent. It was very clear to me from his attacks on vote by mail right after the Wisconsin and Iowa primaries that he was setting the deck to declare all vote by mail ballots not received on election day valid. And let me tell you why that's important. Florida is one of the few states that allow election officials time to process vote by mail ballots. Before 2020, we had 15 days in advance of the election, we could start processing the vote by mail ballots. That is, verifying that they come from an actual individual who's registered to vote, who had requested it, match the signatures, and then start feeding them into tabulators so that when we turn the tabulators on election night, we'll get initial totals. In a majority of the states in this country, that is illegal. In states that were the battleground states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, their laws prohibit the counting of absentee or vote by mail ballots until after election day or election night. And so that meant that this vast army of Democratic votes, which are being deluged into these offices, they're not going to be counted on the day that they're received because there are simply too many of them. They're going to take time and count them the same way Florida does, which, by the way, now we have 22 days. We got 22, we can start processing 22 days. That's why in the 2020 election, on election night, Florida has all of their numbers in. All the in-person early voting is tabulated because that was finished before election day. All vote by mail ballots are processed during this 22-day period. So they're ready to go. And then the precinct results come in on election night and they're fed right in, and boom, by 10 o'clock, 99% of Florida's votes are in and tabulated. But not so in Michigan, not so in Wisconsin, and not so in Pennsylvania. Trump knew this, and he tried to have all of these votes declared illegal because they weren't cast on election day. Well, they've never been cast on election day and counted in those states ever. But so few Americans actually know how the election processes work that they really were conned by why are these votes coming in on the next day and on the next day? There must be something wrong. And there wasn't. And a whole host of lies were promulgated. For example, many of you have heard, well, they were pulling out trunks from underneath the tables, and now these new ballots were being counted. Ladies and gentlemen, those were normal ballot transfer cases that vote by mail ballots are stored in until they are fed into the tabulators. They're not hidden votes. Those are the regular votes. They're stored in these plastic bins and then brought out in batches of either 50 or 100 or 25, depending upon what you use, and you feed them in and then you audit it, then you feed them in and you audit it. It's a laborious process to tabulate vote by mail ballots, which is why the supervisor start of them for Republicans anyway. The Republicans said, sure, we like that idea. Count them ahead of time. Well, all through the 2020 election cycle, the election officials in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania tried to get their Republican-dominated legislators to change the law to match Florida. No way, Jose. They knew exactly what they were doing. This was a plan implemented by Trump, pushed by his attorney general, who made the same kind of false statements relative to, well, there's fraud in vote by mail ballots. There may be fraud, but it is so minor as to be really not even countable. We saw that here in Florida, for example. In Florida, we've arrested 4 people so far for double voting. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? They all live in the villages, highly Republican area, and were voting in all likelihood for Trump. Those are the only double voters that we've been able to catch so far in the state of Florida. They were Trump voters. And 4 out of 8 million voters, this is really not going to change any results. This whole thing of voter fraud has been a false war waged by the Republican Party since 2002 to try to limit African-American voting at the polls so that the Republicans could gain an advantage over the Democratic Party. And that is where we are today. It has been a continual effort since 1998, as far back as I can trace it, to now to make whatever method the African-American voters in Florida want to use, that's going to be the target. So the only savings grace that I can tell you about this is that they didn't target in-person early voting. And so Florida still has 15 days of in-person early voting, and all of the urban areas, Orlando, Miami, Broward, Fort Lauderdale, Tampa, they are all going to have that full 15 days utilized, and they will be having souls to the polls drives. I don't know whether people will revert back to their previous behavior or continue to vote by mail. But if you're going to vote by mail, you need to call the Supervisor of Elections office and make sure that they have all of the information that is necessary to give you a vote by mail ballot. And since the First District Court of Appeals and the 11th Circuit has struck down the attempts to ameliorate SB 90, that means that there are limitations on drop boxes that can be used in the state of Florida. And supervisor of elections in this state are faced with $25,000 personal criminal fines if they don't follow these laws. Now, one time have they broken any law, but this is a whole effort now, because again, all the supervisor of elections, even the Republican ones, want all the legitimate voters in their community to vote. This does not suit the Republican Party in the state of Florida very well at all. They want to intimidate the supervisor of elections. They want to threaten them. They want them to not be as aggressive in pursuing voters. And I will tell you that this has been a national effort that Florida has been the leader of. In February of 2020, Heritage Action, which is a subsidiary group of the Heritage Foundation, met and put together best practices for elections. These best practices are so ludicrous as to boggle the mind. What are their best practices? Their best practices are put limits on drop boxes, limit vote by mail ballots, barring election officials from mailing out unsolicited vote by mail applications, allow more partisan observers to interfere in observing the election and get them in deeper in the process where they've never been, inside our offices, challenging election officials' decisions to count votes. To bar third-party individuals from collecting ballots for their friends and neighbors, something that was legal in Florida except for Miami-Dade until the SB 90 legislation passed. They also barred private donations to election officials. And what they were aimed at here were the private monies given by a number of organizations, the Mark Zuckerberg Foundation, Arnold Schwarzenegger's organization, and others. They gave election grants because the Republicans at the federal level blocked a piece of legislation called the SAFE Act, which would have given hundreds of millions of dollars to be distributed to election officials so they could buy PPE, disinfectants, the plastic barriers. None of that was in any Florida supervisor of elections budgets, because the budgets have to be done a year before the election. Before COVID hit, all the budgets were set. They didn't have money for this. They were desperate for these supplies. The Republicans blocked them at the federal level, but these private organizations made grants available to any election office that wanted them in the country. 9 urban Republican supervisor of elections requested and got grants for their community. All of these grants are barred. You may not accept any money. So interestingly enough, if they don't fund you to do the work you need to do, I guess you don't do it. And that's part of what they're attempting to do, because the state of Florida does not fund elections. Elections are totally funded by the county commissions of the respective jurisdictions. Leon County Commission supplies all the money for the supervisor of elections office in Leon County. There are 0 state funds, and unless there are federal legislation that passes, there was 0 federal legislation dollars as well. In addition to this, so these 8 points that were pushed by Heritage Action were implemented in every state. And how was that? Well, Florida played a major role. It seems that Senator Joe Gruters, who's a senator from Manatee, happens to be on the Republican National Committee and is the chairman of the Voter Integrity Project. And so he and the Heritage Action Group actually worked together to make sure that in every Republican-controlled legislature, these same things that I had mentioned, targeting the drop boxes, adding more elements to vote by mail, barring the funds, increasing criminal penalties. They're in almost every one of these Republican states. They're in Florida. They're in Georgia. They're in Arizona. They're in Iowa. Because in fact, this is a national script which they are running through based upon the big lie. We're going to have to pick more protections. And we didn't need any more protections. There was no election fraud on any massive scale. And in each state where Trump appointed judges looked at it, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they have no evidence of fraud. And you can't throw out elections without evidence. There is none, and it's a complete falsehood. But again, a falsehood on the falsehood that voters are committing voter fraud. It's been a part and parcel since Attorney General Ashcroft implemented the first voter integrity project in the Bush administration in 2002. So with that kind of overbroad look at where we are, how we got here, I'm going to open it up for questions now.
Okay, we have a question in the chat, and
Okay.
it's about it. The person wonders what will happen. The 2022 congressional lines are not set in the next month prior to primary early voting. What will happen?
Well, as of today's decision, we have the First District Court of Appeals putting into effect the Ron DeSantis plan for redistricting. Unless the Florida Supreme Court, which has a 6-1 margin of DeSantis appointed judges, accepts the case for review, it's over. And the plan that will be put into place for reapportionment, for redistricting, is going to be the plan that Ron DeSantis and the Florida legislature bowed and accepted and rejected their own plan for this one. That's what's going to happen. So barring a miracle, and quite frankly, I don't see the DeSantis tainted Florida Supreme Court even accepting the case for review. That means that this First District Court of Appeal decision by Judge Tannenbaum will be that which sets the district boundaries for the primary election in August.
Kathy, you're muted.
I have a question, Ian. Given everything that you've told us, is your feeling that the local Democratic Party should encourage or discourage mail voting?
Well, mail voting still is a good way to do it if you have all of these required elements in process. And so one of the very first things that I'm really advising every citizen of Leon County is call Mark's office. Call and ask, am I able to request a vote by mail ballot in the future, given the new requirements? And if not, you can't give them the information over the phone and get it. The information has to be there already. That's another little tidbit in this law. So that means if they tell you you're not, then you basically have to go either fill out a paper form or go to the online web portal and add the elements that you're missing there. If you do that, you shouldn't have a problem voting by mail. If you don't do that, I foresee hundreds of voters not getting their vote by mail ballot and being frustrated. I can't make a recommendation. I will tell you there are no, because I don't know what the environment is going to look like in November of 2022. Will we be in another COVID-19 wave? Will we have another outbreak of a new variant? I don't know. It's too far away for me to be able to discern that. And that, I know that's tough for planning. But again, All the in-person voting options do not change at all in the state of Florida. Only vote by mail was attacked because so many Democrats voted by mail.
Monica.
Thank you. I was wondering, since you have a number of people who sometimes really do not want to vote in that particular race, why isn't the option to say no vote in everywhere, so that you know that the person's intention was not to vote in that race and it's not an undervote? Thank you.
Well, only one state in the country, Nevada, has such a kind of none of the above or no selection made. Only that state does. Florida doesn't have it because Florida's voting regulations are complex. Chapters 97 through 106 inclusive are the election code. It is complex. It is difficult to read because, quite frankly, some of it is even outdated. But because it tells you exactly who's going to be on the ballot, the placement of the ballot, the order of the candidates, there is no way to add no choice or none of or no selection made. That can't be done in the state of Florida because of Florida's statutory laws which govern election. It's as simple as that. If the legislature said do so, you could do it. You're not going to do it. The Florida legislature, for example, is one of the more reactionary legislatures in the country. For example, in the latest bill that passed, there is a way to vote that's being circulated around the country, and you actually vote for more than one. That's barred in the state of Florida now. And Florida, when the 1968 Constitution was written, was built around home rule. Well, the Republicans really in the last 10 years have stripped away the ability of home rule. For example, Leon County in 2002 adopted a charter which said that the Leon County Supervisor of Elections Office is nonpartisan. I made that decision. I went to the Charter Commission and said, the Supervisor of Elections Office really should be nonpartisan. We don't work for one party or two parties. We work for all the parties and all of the citizens. The Supreme Court last year struck that down and said, Leon County doesn't have the home rule authority to make the Supervisor of Elections Office nonpartisan. It has to be partisan. And again, that's something that really runs against the recommendations made after the 2000 election. After that election, there was a wonderful document called Revitalizing Elections in Florida that was staffed by the Collins Center and co-chaired by Secretary of State Jim Smith and the University of Miami president at the time. One of the recommendations of that document was every election official in the state should be nonpartisan. The Florida legislature did not like that and does not want nonpartisan election officials. They like partisanship. They're wedded to it, and they blocked every effort that the Supervisor of Elections Association tried to pass non-partisan Supervisor of Elections offices. So again, the Supreme Court now has stricken the ability of home rule for counties, and they did so without even a request for a rehearing. As someone with a law degree, I'll tell you the way they went around striking down this law was completely unusual. But given the kind of Supreme Court we now have, among the worst in the country, it's going to be the way it's going to be. More?
I think there's one more in the chat.
Yeah, I lost my mouse. Sorry, Kathy.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a two-part question, Ion. It was more of like, can a person who's been purged be reinstated by requesting a vote by mail ballot?
Okay, this is This is a term of art question. Let me tell you that you don't get purged and removed from the rolls. The way we do it in Florida is if you don't vote in two consecutive federal elections for 4 years, you're moved to an inactive list. An inactive list. Now, anyone on the inactive list, any contact they have with the election office reinserts them back into the active rolls. So if you haven't voted, what happens is the county prints a list. These are inactive voters. If you're an inactive voter, you can call them up and say, I want to vote by mail ballot. And then they'll ask you for information. It all coincides. Well, yeah, you'll get it. And you're reinstated from the inactive list. Now, if you're on the inactive list for several years, you're then dropped off all lists. That's called purged. If you're removed completely from the active list and the inactive list and removed, now you're purged. And the only way you can vote is to re-register, which means really just going on the online portal and filling it out again. That's what it means. But if you are truly purged, that is not on the active list and not on the inactive list, you can't just get back on the list by contacting the office. You have to fill out paperwork to do it.
Steve?
Now,
And that has to be
Sorry.
prior to book closing.
yes,
Sorry,
29
Kathy, you
days
got a
before the
hand up.
election, book closing.
Steve? You're still muted.
Now, I do see a question here relative to how do I take my vote by mail ballot to early voting to vote normally? And can I vote at my precinct? And the answer is yes. There are some states that prohibit this. If you request to vote by mail ballot and try to vote in person, you violate the law in some states, not in Florida. We're pretty flexible there. But what if you want to vote normally at in-person voting site or in the precinct on election day, to do that, you simply bring your ballot that you received in the mail. You turn it over to the clerk. He voids it and will give you the proper ballot for the early voting site or the precinct site. Now, if you don't bring that ballot back because they don't know whether you've mailed it in and they don't have that updated on their screen, they're going to make you vote provisionally, which is the equivalent of voting an absentee ballot. For those of you who vote an absentee ballot, you put your name, I am Sancho, the reason why you're doing this, and your address, your precinct, your driver's license number. It takes more time to vote provisionally. But I will tell you, in Leon County, every provisional ballot is counted. And that's important because after 2002, and again, the reason we have provisional ballots is because of Florida in the 2000 election. When individuals came to vote in Florida in the 2000 election, and they were on this felons list that was sent out by Catherine Herron's office, the clerk would say, you're not allowed to vote. We have you identified as a felon. There's no appeal. People were in Jacksonville. I talked to many people in Jacksonville. Sadly, they were tragically hammered by this. People were threatened to be arrested. If you don't leave the precinct now, we're going to arrest you. But I've been voting all my life. I'm not a felon. No appeal on election day. So in the 2002 Help America Vote Act, they put in something called a fail-safe ballot, which even if the election official says you're not registered to vote, you can fill out this provisional ballot and it goes back to the office. And when they do research and find out they've made a mistake, then that ballot will count. But they didn't have those in the 2000 election. But because so many of these, again, 18,000 African Americans were turned away when they went to the polls. There was no recourse. So that's why there's a provisional ballot. And the provisional ballot was designed to give voters a second chance, make sure their vote counted. What did the Republicans do? They restricted it and made it pejorative. They passed something called the Right Church, Wrong Pew law. And Florida has such a law. For example, it doesn't matter where you live in Leon County, everybody in Leon County can vote for the Senate and the president and vice president because they're on every ballot in the state. So why do you need to go to your right precinct to vote for the president? In about 50% of the states, they allow you to vote in the wrong precinct, but they'll count all of your legitimate votes that fall within your legitimate jurisdiction, which means that they'll count that presidential vote, they'll count that Senate vote. Not in Florida. In Florida, if you go to the wrong precinct, not the one that's signed to you, and you vote this provisional ballot, you're going to toss it without even looking to see, not even counting your presidential or your senatorial vote. Because why? Because the legislature has the right to do that. The legislature determines the voting rules, particularly now that the Voting Rights Act is simply a dead letter law. So again, Florida has been the leader. Most of the Republican states have adopted the Right Church, Wrong Pew legislation. Why? Because the individuals that they perceive to be more likely to go to the wrong precinct is probably going to be a Democratic voter. And so we want to cut them out. That's why that law is there.
Go ahead, Steve.
I think I heard you say that in 2010, the legislature abolished early voting on Sundays.
Yes.
My impression is that there is early voting on Sundays now. Did something change?
Yes. Yes, the 2010 election. The 2012 election. The last voter, I oppose House Bill 1355, which, by the way, in 2010 was written by Bucky Mitchell, who now was the general counsel of the Republican Party. He authored 1355. I know this because I talked to two supervisor of elections and the Secretary of State who told me this. So actually this legislation was authored by the state Republican Party, and it banned Sunday voting completely forever. But you have, and the dirty little secret about early voting is early voting doesn't increase turnout. What early voting does is allow the election official to distribute the election totals over 16 days, 15 days of early voting and 1 day of in-person voting. So this then allows your election infrastructure not to be overwhelmed, and you don't have as long lines. That's what early voting does. But what happened was when they got rid of early voting in 2010, voters in Miami-Dade and another county waited for 7 hours. They voted after 2 in the morning. This caused a huge media outcry. Over 70% of the people, I saw the polls, were furious at the Republican legislature, and they restored in the following legislative session, they restored the ability of supervisor of elections to have Sunday voting. They restored the hours that they stripped out because in 2010. So they basically were forced to because they were embarrassed. They were embarrassed at having little old ladies vote at 2 in the morning after waiting for 7 hours to cast their vote because there was no early voting.
Amazing.
And well,
Okay.
they should be embarrassed. Let's see, it looks like we have time for these 2 more questions, if it's all right with you, Ion.
Certainly.
We got one more in the chat too.
Okay, then maybe we can try and make the questions and answers not too long. I think everyone's loving hearing your discussion, but I don't want to stray too long beyond the hour. John and Shirley?
I have a question, Ian. Just to shift it a little bit to registering new voters. With the new changes in the law, could you please discuss some of the limitations and risks or problems that can occur if there are errors in how this is complied with by people?
Well, since the 11th Circuit has struck down Mark Walker's decision to toss out SB 90, that means that, for example, if you're registering someone to vote, you have to tell them, if you're a third party collector of this information, you have to tell them that by filling out this piece of paper, they might not be registered to vote. That's what you must tell them. That's in SB 90. Filling out this voter registration does not mean you're registered to vote in the state of Florida. That's what every third party solicitor has to tell the voter. Why? To try to make them not register to vote with you. That's why it's in the law. And in fact, you will be fined if you turn in a voter registration application to the wrong county. And this is critical in every urban area. For example, in Leon County, if you're doing voter registration at a shopping center or another site, you're liable to get people from Jefferson County registering, or Wakulla County, or Gadsden County. Well, if you have to now, and before you could turn them all into your home supervisor of elections, and they would send them out to the right counties. That's illegal now. If you take all of those applications in, now you have to scrutinize to make sure, well, I can only bring the ones in Leon County to the Leon County Supervisor of Elections. I can only bring the ones in Gadsden County to Shirley Knight. The Supervisor of Elections over here in Jefferson County quit because he could not stand the Byzantine new rules, which quite frankly made no sense to him. And that's another thing that you're seeing. A lot of Supervisor of Elections are going to leave in the state of Florida. The Supervisor of Elections in Monroe County has said as much. She can't comply with this and be in good conscience serving her citizens. And so a lot of the older election officials who are Supervisor of Elections are throwing up their hands and saying, this is crazy. I can't do it anymore. And they're leaving. And this is an intended effect of these kinds of laws on the Supervisor of Elections, as are the criminal sanctions which are now being placed upon them. And now the election police, which with no complaint can investigate your office for illegal actions with no complaints. With no citizen complaints, they can independently launch an investigation. And this is intimidating. They did it to me in 2008. I was actually investigated by Homeland Security. They, in 2008, requested my entire file of voter registration because they were sure that I had allowed illegal immigrants to be registered to vote in Leon County, which of course they couldn't find any, but still they want to try to intimidate election officials. And I've been threatened by attorneys from the Secretary of State on innumerable occasions. Having a law degree, though, pretty much, my attitude, I can tell you when I told the Secretary of State, sue me. If you don't think I'm doing the right thing in providing services to my Leon County citizens, sue me. I dare you to do that, because I would rather be sued providing services to them than do what you're trying to do, which is to restrict access to the vote.
Thank you. Mary?
Yes, my question is, what action can we take if we check to see if our mail ballot has not reached the election office?
Well, actually, Leon County has a feature to search for vote by mail ballots. I know this because in 2008, our office received a National Freedom Award from the Election Center because we developed an in-house ballot tracking system. So for example, we can actually track that ballot through the barcode system to where it actually is. We can tell whether it's in the postal authority. We can tell whether it's been delivered. We can tell where in the chain it is because we have piggybacked on technology that the Postal Service uses. Now, that's another issue entirely because the Postal Service is not a government agency. So your vote by mail service is only as good as the postmaster in your jurisdiction. And early on in my administration, I had problems with my postmaster, but he retired and we got a good one. But a bad postmaster can mean that those ballots are not going to be delivered to the office. But at that point, we could actually find out that, hey, our records show that they're at the they're right now at the post office. That's where they are. And what we did with the new postmaster was at 6:30, we actually drive to the main post office. That's one of the reasons we have a different colored vote by mail envelope is that the postmaster allow us to look through all of their bins of unprocessed mail so we could see those green envelopes and we could collect them. Even before they're processed by the post office would allow us to go through their files and pull them and get them into the office so they would count by 7 p.m. But that's something that I put together with the postmaster. And again, it only works as well as your supervisor and your postmaster in cooperation. Because I will tell you, by the way, the consolidation of the postal system has put major problems. Our ballots are processed in Jacksonville. People that vote by mail, they go to Jacksonville and they come back to Tallahassee. That's what the regionalization to save money in postal service means. So it does take more time to vote by mail. And if you have any issue with that ballot not reaching you, call the Supervisor of Elections office and ask them to track it down. They can do that.
Hey, Ian, I just wanted to say, I worked the elections last year, and when a person came in that had requested a vote by mail ballot and they didn't have it with them, we could cancel it in the system immediately and give them the ballot right then and there. And then if they did send in that vote by mail ballot, it's no good. Or
Correct.
if the office received the vote by mail ballot, the staffer would see that they requested it. And then it'd be like, well, your vote by mail ballot was received. So I just wanted to say that. And also 524 instructed all of the third parties that they don't have to list those 3 caveats anymore. But the legislature did say now that the Secretary of State or whatever, those caveats have to go on the voter registration application. And you know how tight that voter registration application is already. So
right, putting more stuff on there, it's unnecessary, makes it more difficult to read. But again, that makes it harder to use, and that's okay.
And there was just one more question, and then I know Kathy wants to give a plug for the voter guide. One person wanted to know about requesting the vote by mail ballot. You know how we have to do it starting in 2024, you have to do it. There, I just answered it.
Yes. The new laws don't go really in effect until the next presidential election. Even though they didn't want to give on that. And I will tell you, if any of you have the opportunity, you should download and read Judge Mark Walker's decision in striking down the validity of SB 90. It is a marvelous, marvelous decision. It is the history of vote suppression writ large. 200 pages of his decision is the history of voting suppression in the state of Florida. If you want a one-read course in voter suppression, you need to read Mark Walker's decision in that case. I downloaded it. It's a huge decision, 297 pages, but quite frankly, it was reviewed around the country. It is the best written decision affirming a United States citizen's right to vote that I have read in my life in a legal document. He is marvelous. And I will tell you right now, my choice, if we ever get a new Democratic president choice for the Supreme Court, Mark Walker should be on that court. His decision is so robust as to make him really a first tier civil rights justice. I appreciate Mark Walker in this circuit.
Yes, he really, it's too bad. It's really too bad the court's above him. Well, I want to thank you so much, Ayan, and everyone who came tonight. You're one of our community treasures, and we appreciate you making the time to come. And I hope all of us will share what we've learned tonight with our family and friends, and encourage people to keep up the fight and get out to vote. And if you enjoyed this program and want to know more about the upcoming election, Eric, would you like to put up the forum screen real quick? We're going to be having our Democratic candidate forums every Saturday at 2, starting June 18th. And let's see. So they'll be on all the city and county candidates and school board races. So we hope you can join us then. And then the other screen too, please, Eric. Before we close, I want to ask for your help. Just by being here tonight, you've demonstrated your concern for civic involvement. The Democratic Party needs your help. We need help to knock on doors, postcard, be a poll watcher, do phone and text banks. We need, if there's something you love to do, I bet you could do it and help promote good elections and our democracy. So please email me if you want to talk about ways you can pitch in. Maybe Steve will put my email in the chat for us. Secondly, we really need your help paying for voter guide postcards. While the Supervisor of Elections sends out voter guides to everyone, which are very helpful, the Democratic Party has sent out these voter guide postcards. I think that's the most important thing that the local Democratic Party did in 2020 was to send one of these guides to every Democratic household for the primary and every Democratic and NPA household for the general election. The card tells voters who the Democrats are, even in the so-called nonpartisan races. It gives critical information about voting early and by mail, which, as we know this year, will be even more important. And it gives our helpline number to call for information and help. And we got a lot of calls from citizens across the county in 2020. So we need to raise $27,000 to get the cards to 74,000 Democratic homes for the primary, and vote by mail starts in just 2 months when those ballots are sent out. So we need to raise the money as soon as possible. So please give what you can. You can use this QR code or the online email address, which we'll also put in the chat. So we need Dems who can to help. So thank you all so much for coming. Let's go out and elect ourselves the government we deserve. Thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you, Ayan.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
I will tell you that anyone that wants to read any stuff that I'm doing, I do Twitter. Ion Sancho 1 is my handle, and I write about elections and election stories every day.
Ion, you're a great speaker. That was fascinating.
Yes, I agree.
Well, thank you.
And if you want to write postcards, I put an email in the chat for free. We've done all the fundraising for you. We're on the brink of 12,000 postcards to Leon voters right now.
Awesome.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy weekend. Happy Memorial Day. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Well, I am